Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to our November Trauma-Informed Workshop Series. Our topic is on the Native American tribes and improving our services and benefits to tribal communities. We have two speakers, actually a mother and daughter duo, which I think is very special. So first I'm going to introduce Connie Reitman. So Ms. Reitman is currently serving as the Executive Director in the Intertribal Council of California, a statewide tribal organization comprised of 50 tribes and tribal organizations. Ms. Wright has 40 years of experience in community development, promoting social and economic development primarily for underserved tribal communities in rural areas. Her experience includes public policy development at the federal, state, and community levels with a focus on recognizing the unique government-to-government relationship between tribes and state and federal government entities. She has been successful in the design of systems of care that provide important services for tribal children, youth, families, and communities in health, education, social services, and economic development. She has been active on various boards, commissions, committees, and councils with a long list that's about a paragraph wide. So lots of good opportunities there for leadership. Now I'll introduce Yeshelle Sparks. Yeshelle has been an advocate for victims' rights for nearly 20 years. She specializes in victim assistance for victims of sexual assault and domestic violence in the Indian country. She is the Tribal Advocate Regional Coordinator for the Intertribal Council with her office in Sonoma County and the Sonoma County Indian Health Project. In her current position, her work includes public policy development, training, technical assistance, program evaluation, strategic planning, crisis intervention, court accompaniment, and case management, all in a day's work. She is responsible for serving 12 counties. Ms. Sparks provides training to law enforcement officers, victim witness centers, and community agencies of domestic violence, stalking, child abuse, sexual assault, and the impact of violence on children. She's been an advisor and mentor to community and school-based programs. Ms. Sparks has presented informational trainings to college students on domestic violence and dating relationships as part of an ongoing college course. She was involved in a critical research project on the administrative of justice in Indian country. She has assisted in the drafting of a number of publications and manuals on issues related to victim services. She provides support, training, and technical assistance for the program's volunteer development as well. So thank you so much. We've been trying to coordinate a training opportunity with the Intertribal Council for about 4 or 5 months now. So we're so honored that you guys can be here today. We're also live streaming through our YouTube channel for our advocate participants, our JPs across the state, and for staff who want to view the training opportunity later. And there's a second session of this training after today. So please go back and tell all your colleagues that they should come in the afternoon, right? All right, so I'm going to pass it over to Yeshelle and Connie. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank all of you for joining us this morning. We're very happy to have this opportunity to share some of the experiences we've had over the years in working with victims from tribal communities and their families. So again, she mentioned we work for the Intertribal Council of California, which is a statewide association of tribal governments and tribal organizations. And one of the primary roles we play is to be an administrative unit for tribes that don't have the organization and structure to administer programs. So we bring the tribes together under one consortium, in this case for victim services. So under our victim services program, we have 30 tribes that are members of that consortium. So we administer the victim services program for 30 tribes throughout California. So there's 113 tribes in the state of California, and these are the recognized, federally recognized tribes, but there's an additional, what we consider California tribal communities. There's about 50 of those throughout California. And they're not as structured as the federally recognized tribes, but again, we'll share a little bit of background around what the difference is there and why that's important. Again, a little bit about intertribal. One of the key things for intertribal was creating capacity of tribal governments. And so in 1968, when they first formed, it was under the Johnson administration anti-poverty programs. And in order to qualify for the anti-poverty funding source, they had to have a minimum population of 2,000 people. So again, we'll talk a little bit about the history of what happened in California and why tribal communities weren't eligible for many services due to the lack of the criteria requiring a certain population level. So that was another criteria that is very difficult for tribes to meet, are any criteria based on population. And again, we'll share a perspective of why historically tribes have been impacted by some public policy that has essentially reduced the tribal population, and therefore we are limited in our capacity to compete with other populations for funding from the federal or state government. So we'll share a little bit about that too. You want to say anything, Yeshelle? Okay. So what we put together is strengthening relationships with tribal communities. We think it's really important to provide information that will hopefully strengthen the relationships that service providers, especially non-tribal service providers, have with tribal communities, because they are distinct types of communities. So this is really, when we do this program, it's really a 2-day session, but we've amended it to reflect some of the time limitations that different groups have. So today, this is just an introduction. It's not a real type of cultural competency that we do, rather it's an introduction. So what we really hope to achieve here is to improve the delivery of services, whatever they may be, to tribal communities. And then to share foundational information to promote collaborations and networking and consortia work with tribal communities, because they're very familiar with those types of approaches to addressing a myriad of problems. These are the different elements we're going to be going through very quickly, because like I mentioned, this is a 2-day session, but again, we think it's so important to share elements of these different components because they all contribute to the conditions that exist in tribal communities today. So we're going to look at a little bit at historical perspective, traditions of tribal people, historical sources of trauma to give you an idea of what that looks like from a tribal perspective, and then share some of the cultural values that are remaining in our communities that we're trying to recover. And then some emerging practices which would be helpful for you to be aware of, so that as you look for resources and information, these emerging practices can become something you can look to help victims. And then we're going to look a little bit of the healing and recovery that's happening in tribal communities, because it's something that is relatively new to our communities, starting about 40 years ago. And so we're still looking at this as a fairly recent effort of our tribal communities to recover. And then sharing some resources with all of you in terms of what might be helpful in addressing the needs of victims as you work with them.
Good morning, everyone. So really quickly, I just want to say what I need to say from a traditional stance, because my mother and I are here together, and I'm really happy about that. I get to glean from her, and that really blesses me. I'm happy to be here with you, and thank you all for coming. We come, and I tell this, you know, some of you have heard me speak or Connie speak before, but we come from a family that's a family of healers, and it's handed down in the family. It's not something that you can just become in our tribe. And so we come from that family, and my grandfather passed it to my grandmother. It skips a generation. And so my grandmother passed it to me, and it skipped over my family, my mom, but it didn't really, because we were taught, and grandma took mom with her everywhere, and mom took me, and you know, usually it was mom, grandma, and me, my sister too, but now I take my kids when I can, and we were taught that it's our purpose to help our people to get better. So we learned that, you know, we'd be sleeping in the hotel lobbies or on the floor next to the caucus going on till whatever time, because we were being taught that. And so, you know, a lot of people, when we say we want to bring our people back to our traditions, you know, I've even had people go, oh, what do you want, teepees back? Well, for one, we didn't live in teepees, we lived in Hogan's. But for two, that's not what we meant. We mean we want to see our people healthy again, and we want to see our traditions alive again, because they have their place. That's what helped make us healthy. And so our part as healers doesn't look like, you know, you might see in a book or in the movies or whatever. This is our part of healing our people. So we're continuing that journey of healing. And I want to say thank you to my mother for teaching me that, and the respect I have for her, and missing my grandmother as we're standing here, because she's the one who was the matriarch of our family, and she's been gone over 20 years now. But I think it's important for you to know that's why we do what we do, because we want to bring healing, and we want to open up communication and help you understand what you need to about us so you can better help us. So thank you. Thank you, Mom.
Welcome. As it says here, it talks about the journey of cultural competency. And I know all of you are being exposed to culturally proficient services in the work that you do, because it's in mental health, it's in healthcare systems. I know that federal policy is looking at cultural competency is really being important because of the diversity of our community, wherever we're at. So again, you might want to look this doctor up. She's very famous for the work she's doing in cultural competency. But again, this is something we share with her, that it's a process and not just a session. And so we encourage you to look more for other sources of information. So you want to...
Sometimes some advocates get frustrated with me because they don't understand why I do what I do, even law enforcement or the DA, why I ask the questions I ask, or why I stay so long with a victim. But this is how we see our families from a multifaceted perspective. We're not helping them in one area. We're trying to help them in many areas so that we don't see, you know, returning to violent situations or the many different things that can happen. So you see the different areas that we're looking at. If you're affected in your health, in behavioral health, or in mental health, drug and alcohol related issues can be with that. You know, you have a plethora of things that can be going on with a person. And so our job, and especially in our communities, victim advocates, a lot of times in Indian country, know the families they're working with and have known them for literally hundreds of years. Those families have had relationships. And so, you know, we look at one area and we think, well, we got to check out what's going on in all these other areas, because if there's something off kilter in one, it's probably going to be off in another. And so, you know, you'll see us with the same client sometimes for a few years, because we're trying to help them get better, you know, make sure we don't just push them through and say, this is what we can give you, we'll see you later, because it's not traditional based services that way. So we try to look at the mental, which, you know, right away we'll go to spiritual. These are, you know, the different components of mental health that we need to look at. So a lot, would this be a good time for me to just talk about healers even in what we're looking at? So in our language, there's no other way, I guess, to put it other than you could say healer or translate like doctor. And we have those in our communities. And you know, sometimes our people don't want to go to a licensed clinical social worker or a therapist or a psychologist or whatever, because of trust issues or the stigma that it carries, you know, or they're just used to the traditional practice of using a healer. And, you know, sometimes you have to be careful, and it's been good that I've gotten a lot of calls when people have questions, but sometimes people are self-proclaimed healers, and they're not accepted by the tribes or the bands, and yet they're going around telling people that's what they do. And that's why, for me, when I was talking to you about who we are, it was important that I mentioned to you that that's my family line, because that's how we handle it. If we would know that somebody wasn't a healer in my band if they were outside of that family lineage, and other people would know that. So it's a safety thing. So when you're talking to, a victim about what they need and they say they want a healer, then, a good question to ask is, okay, who is the accepted healer of your band or your tribe? And I say band because I'm Pomo. I'm from Lake County. My band is Big Valley Band of Pomo Indians, but there are 6 other bands. Well, in Lake Mendocino and Sonoma, there's 26 different bands of the same tribe with different dialects and sometimes different beliefs from, the different areas. And so you have to be careful of who that healer. You can't say, well, we know a healer at the Big Valley, we're going to send, you have to go to this person because that's who we're working with. That may not work for that person. So it's good to have the dialogue with the advocates from those areas so that they can help you figure out what the best way is to go along with that process.
And please, we encourage you to ask questions anytime for clarification. So we wanted to share a little bit about the history in California, and this really reflects the pre-contact tribal territories. And as you can see, there were a number of territories that were identified in California in the different tribes. And so we wanted to share that with you too, because this relates to how tribal people see themselves, because they relate a lot to where they come from the geographical area. The one area that we want to acknowledge too is that in California, there are a lot of what is called out-of-state tribal people. So that for people that are getting clients from the urban areas, those families may come from North Dakota, South Dakota, Arizona, Alaska, all over the United States. And so they were, through public policy, relocated here to California. So you'll have those types of families too that you're going to be working with. And so again, we just want to share this because the diversity of tribes in California is huge. And so that's the other thing. One size does not fit all. And where Yeshelle was talking about is we come from the Lake County area, which would be where you see the Pomo area there. You could see Pomo there. So what impact did colonization have in tribal communities? And one of those major impacts was the access to resources to maintain your families, maintain a healthy way of life. And so with the reduction of land and the resources, it impacted tribal people immensely. They weren't able to access the traditional foods and other items that they used. And, we always laugh about how in the tribal communities, there used to be certain periods of time during the year when we'd go to the coast, or we'd go down to the Bay Area, or we'd come over here to the Valley, or we'd go over to the Bishop area. And so there were migratory patterns of the tribes where we used to really travel quite a bit, and we used to trade and so on and so forth. So one of the things that happened in the process of colonization was that the reduction of the land really made a difference. And one of those was this development of what are called reservation or rancherias. So how many of you have heard of a reservation or rancheria before? So, oh my gosh, all of you have. Well, that's good news. So you know what we're talking about is essentially those were places where tribal people were told that they could stay. Well, and that's part of the dilemma, is that the removal of tribal people was to places where nobody else wanted the land. And so as a consequence, we're looking at this point in time too, and many communities aren't able to really do a lot of economic development due to their geographical location and isolation. So there were a lot of policies that impacted tribal people, and so we're really exposed a lot to public policy and how public policy impacts the family and your community. And so a lot of times we're a lot more involved in politics than most because we understand public policy can really impact a family's living. And so they were looking at, this was in the eastern portion of the United States, and of course that was in the 1830s, and it impacted thousands and thousands of American Indians. And so they were looking at the cotton and slave industry at that time, and so everyone was getting moved more to the west. I think the key for us as tribal people was that we always were hoping to negotiate for some salvaging of some of the land for our families, but essentially that was not the case. And so as you can see there from the dates, it was literally hundreds of years that the policy of removal and isolation was practiced with tribal people. So again, this is a historical experience that's carried down through the families of what has happened to our tribal people. So these are some of the consequences of that colonization, forced labor. And really, you know, the contemporary issues that we talk about today, and for one is like, for instance, the redskin. One of those things that need to be known about redskins is that it's not the name of a tribe, or it's not the color necessarily, but it's about the Native American scalps, which when people would come in to collect the bounty, the trader or whoever was paying them for the body parts or scalps or whatever would say, how many redskins do you have? And so that was the money they would pay. The bounty was for those redskins. And so it isn't about honoring somebody, it's about what it really means. It's not honoring the tribal people, it's talking about the bounties for Native American scalps, and that included children. Relocation was one of the biggest things that impacted tribal communities all across the United States. And it started fairly early on, as everyone knows. And part of the dilemma for us as tribal families was that our names were changed. And in California, names were often the names of the people who you were indentured to. And so we'll get into that a little bit later on, but one of the things that has been really helpful for us to share with people in California in particular is the historical policy that impacted tribal people just in California. And I think it's something that very few people are exposed to, and so therefore there's not a real good understanding of why some tribal communities and people are still very reluctant to interact with the government. And so I think this gives a little insight to what happened here in California. It's a little hard reading, but I would encourage everyone to read it because it is indicative of the experience of tribal people and why they may be reluctant to talk to you or engage. And so it's not you necessarily, it's what their lifelong experience has been. And so it kind of is, if you work, and even us sometimes, we're considered outsiders because we work for programs and services. So don't feel that this is just you or people you work with. It's about just a situation that existed, and we're working on it, all of us together. So one of the things, again, was the name change, and again, it was convenience of usually federal or state or county representatives who needed to have a easier access or way to deal with tribal people. And so that's the experience, again, of tribal people, how things are changed as a matter for convenience sake. I think the key in consideration too is historical perspective in regard for tribal people. And so part of that historical attitude, concept, or philosophy was assimilation was to kill the Indian to save the man. And so that was an effort for literally a number of years. And again, there was pressure for tribal people to adopt other lifestyles, other types of principles, so on and so forth. And looking at partaking in institutional programs and services. So everything was geared towards assimilation. And I think many of you heard over the years about treaties that were made with tribal people. And so treaties were good in the concept, but in reality, the adoption or passing of treaties were really not respected or acknowledged as a real process that the government would use to settle with tribal people. And in California in particular, we had 18 treaties that were proposed by tribal governments and leadership, and none of the treaties were ratified. So even though there were efforts by tribal people to create documents that would establish much more larger areas for tribal people to reside, they were not ever looked at by the federal government. And so in the meantime, a lot of other things happened. So in part of the distrust for federal government or any kind of government representative really starts around the history of the treaties and the work of tribal leadership to engage at a level that would seem reasonable to them in terms of providing for their families, you know, enough clothing and shelters and food and water, that kind of thing. And I think about it today, how we're so sensitive to what is happening in other countries, and we need to really look at how this has happened in America, some of the things with a particular group of people. So I wanted to share a little bit about the history of relationships between the United States and our tribal communities. And as you can see, there were different policies over the years that impacted specifically tribal people. And so in that, there were a number of treaties. The Removal Act happened in the 1800s, mid-1800s, in terms of removing tribal people from their lands and then putting them on reservations. And that happened it's happening even now. And so assimilation was another approach of the federal government to assimilate tribal people into mainstream society. And of course, what we learn today is that a lot of like the Hispanics, African Americans, the Vietnamese, a lot of the immigrants to the United States really are stressing the importance of acknowledging their culture, acknowledging their language, and incorporating that into how we do our business as a government. So again, assimilation effort was used, that you're not to be an Indian, not to speak your language, not to practice your religion. So assimilation was really a big effort up until fairly recent times. Reorganization was another attempt to limit the number of tribal communities and tribal governments in the United States and in California. And termination there, you see that was in 1968. Our rancheria was one of the rancherias. I think there were about 20 rancherias in California that were terminated. And that means that they lost their federal recognition and they were no longer recognized as American Indians. So that termination effort really lasted for a long time, about 20 years, to try and terminate as many Indian tribes as they could possibly. And again, that was to reduce the federal obligation to provide benefits and services based on trust status. So I'll get into that in a little bit. Then self-determination came along, and that's the time that Intertribal Council of California was formed, and many other tribal associations were formed to begin to address some of the challenges in our tribal communities. So self-determination is a key public policy that tribal people reference to or can base some of their changes that are happening in their communities. Really did start around 1968, which in anybody's book is fairly recent. That's the year I graduated from high school. So, and now that's 40 some years ago. So, so self-determination then became federal policy towards American Indians throughout the United States. And so the effort was to really recognize the sovereign status of tribal nations. And that, I think, is really important for folks to have more information about, because it really helps everyone understand some of the things that are currently happening in tribal communities. So we look at the next few significant acts that happened throughout the United States was the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act. And even though some of these acts have been in place for, literally 2 or 3 decades, very little change has actually happened for the education of American Indian children. And we're still looking at some serious challenges there. And really, California was one of the organizing, how would I say, a nucleus like for the change of healthcare for tribal people throughout the United States. And that was because in California, there was no healthcare at all for tribal people. And what kind of spurred this movement, and again, Yeshelle mentioned my mother, was that our families were losing babies at high rates. It was 8 times any other group of people that babies were dying. And so my mother, along with other people, that family members in other tribes, got together, and the Bureau of Maternal and Child Health at that time was headed by a guy named Dr. George Cunningham. Their office was in Berkeley. And I got a chance to work there at the Bureau of Maternal and Child Health, and that was when the funding for the first Indian health clinics came about. And if you go on site to California Rural Indian Health Board, if you want to look at a major resource, is the California Rural Indian Health Board and the Indian health clinics throughout the state of California. And they provide a lot of medical, dental, mental health, behavioral health, and all kinds of different programs. So the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, as you can see there, is 1978. In between that time, the federal policy towards Indian religion was banished. It was not to be practiced. So in 1978, we were able to get federal law that said it's okay for tribal people to practice their religion. And in the meantime, we had this immigration of people from all over the world that are Muslims, that are different religions. And there was no stop on whatever anyone wanted to practice, but it took the American Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978 to allow us to really practice our religions. The Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978 was created out of the necessity to put a little bit of a stopgap on the removal of American Indian children from their families. And unfortunately, since 1978, we haven't seen very much of a change of that in California. And we're really struggling right now with DSS to change some of their policy around the out-of-home placement of tribal children. And we can tell you that the teen suicide rate with children that have been in foster care is extremely high. And so our tribal communities are impacted highly by tribal teen suicides. And the other thing was the robbing of graves and being able to recover items in our universities and college systems that had taken and retained grave items. And so the hope was through this law that our people could recover the remains of their families from these institutions and museums and so on and so forth. So this is as recent as 1990. That it was okay to still rob graves of tribal people. And so I think these are some things that are very dear to our heart in terms of our families and our legacy as families and our history as families, for this type of activity to happen, to be so disrespectful. And so that, again, sends another message to a group of people, doesn't it? That we can do this to you, but everybody else, we're not going to do that to. So these kind of tacit activities really frame some of the primary contact and information and experience of tribal people. So I think why I want to share this, and I often do, is because I know that if someone were to come and knock on your door one day unannounced and say, I'm going to take your child to go get educated, and you could not stop them, that would be traumatic. So again, too, with the graves, if someone were to go and dig up your grandfather or your great-grandfather and take the remains and say, we're going to study it and just do it at will, how would that be? And so these are the kinds of things that didn't happen just yesterday, but happened time after time after time after time. Does that make sense? Does it? Okay. A little bit, yeah. Mm-hmm.
A grave being uncovered, you know, some people that's okay, no big deal, they're dead, you know, and other people that's not part of their belief system. And I, you know, I've shared too before that in some of the tribes, not even just here in California, but all over the U.S., they don't even say the name of the dead. And so when they're having to speak to you and you're saying the name of that person, or they want you to say the name of that person, it's traumatizing or re-victimizing to that person to have to hear the name or to have to say the name. And not only because of them being gone and that's tradition, but they believe that there's something that goes on in the spiritual realm that when they say that name, that's being disturbed. And so if you can imagine, you're already traumatized by what has happened, and you're having to hear or having to say a name that you feel like something else is happening, you believe something else is happening at that same time, they're being traumatized. So, you know, she might just say that, and it might be flippant for someone, and for another person, they're going, oh, we understand, because that's part of our custom too. When we lay a family member to rest, there's a whole thing that happens with that. There's songs and there's, you know, different things, and that a blessing over that. And, you know, we sink baskets and we do these different things. It's a big deal to have any of that disrupted. So I just wanted to share a little bit when she was talking about that to give you another perspective.
Thank you, Yeshelle. I think this is the area that is really new to a lot of people, is about sovereignty of tribal people. And again, this is about being able to govern and really to protect your own communities. And that's what we know our government does for us, right? It protects us through policy and law and so on and so forth. So what we like to share is that tribal sovereignty is in the U.S. Constitution. And a lot of times we're kind of thrown into the basket and say, well, the racial groups. Well, it's not just about racial groups. It's about what is considered nation-to-nation treaties, federal statutes, case law, executive orders, so on and so forth, impact tribal people directly. And so who is Native American?
Loud without it. Thank you. We see gaps in dealing with different services because they don't respect, or they're not aware of the fact that every tribe is a sovereign nation. So when you're dealing with the tribal chairperson, they are the equivalent of the president of the United States. And that is most of the time. Rarely have I ever seen someone regard that chairperson as a president. And so there's already, upon first engagement, some disrespect. Do you think that's going to open up good communication? So I want to share that it's government to government. So it's important to know, because each tribe is a sovereign nation, how they want to interact with you and to respect that.
Thank you, Yeshelle. So there are different levels of recognition of American Indian too, and that may be important for you to know if you're working with tribal people, because they may use different terminology, but it may amount to the same thing. So one of those is a person with some degree of Indian blood or lineal descent. So in our tribe, it's lineal descent. In a tribe in Nevada, it may be you must have 1/2 of that particular tribe's blood degree, or you cannot be a member. A lineal descent, because that's our traditional practice, is it comes through the mother, the matriarch. We were a matriarchal society. And that's contrary to what the images of Native women is, that we were less than, and I don't say the word that is used because it's so disrespectful and it's such an inappropriate use of a word. And so it's very offensive. But a lot of the societies in California were matriarchal. And that's different image than what most people have about tribal communities. They always have the image of the warrior, right? The man being the boss, but that certainly wasn't the case in a lot of the tribes in California. So, so recognized by a tribe or within their community. And that's always key, because the families always know the families. And that's a very important thing in tribal communities, is knowing who your family is and who the family is of other people. So, so they may have varying eligibility criteria. So some say you become a member when you reach 18. Some say you become a member when you're born, you're registered. Some say you got to be 21. So there's different eligibility even within the criteria of descendancy or blood degree or so on and so forth.
And let me just share too with them. So you may hear someone say that there's an auntie, and well, I'll give you an example. A couple of you have heard this story, but I was going to Redwood Children's Center for an interview with a child, and we all got there a little bit early, and I was the last of the early ones, and which didn't make me late though. And so they were already engaged in conversation, and the DA, our new DA, was at the head of the table, and the SO was there, and then another DA was sitting there, and he was leaned back in his chair saying, you know, she lied to us, and, you know, she's lost her credibility with me. And I'm thinking, this is a 17-year-old girl. I'm walking in on this. And I said, what did she lie to you about? Because I, you know, came in late on the conversation. And he said, well, she told us that so-and-so were her aunties and her uncles. And we found out upon further investigation that they were her cousins. And I said, oh, well, that's really easy to fix for you. I said that in our culture, when there are elders, even if they're friends, you know, we've been around each other for so long that you don't call them by their first names, or you don't call them family friends. They are aunties and uncles, and your older cousins, aunties and uncles. And so right there, just that simple little twist, and her credibility was restored with this law enforcement agent, which we all know makes a world of a difference for somebody who's calling themselves a victim. So that's why that's important. And another reason that lineal descent is something that we want to hold to here in California is because it's much easier to tell somebody, oh, you have to have a 16th of, you know, whatever it is to be part of this tribe, rather than to use lineal descent, where your tribal members are going to be able to be part of the tribe if they know who they are related to. So it leaves it more open for them to still have a tribe. If you go the other way, you're going to lose tribal members faster, because, you know, the blood is thinning, so to speak. So that's another reason for lineal descent.
Now, I think the point Yeshelle is making about understanding how that view of family is, it's really extended. And we don't really have a nuclear family model like we have mom, dad, and the kids. In tribal communities, it's grandma, grandpa, great grandma, grandpa, if they're still alive, and aunties and uncles. And an uncle may have the primary role of a father who's not there, and so they have a real big role to play in that family. So you may have victims who don't have fathers, but their uncles or grandfather or someone else will fill that role. So sometimes, as Yeshelle mentioned, they may refer to them in a different way than what we're normally used to. So again, I appreciate your comment, Yeshelle, because these little details like that can make a difference in helping you understand that victim and understanding their view of how they see their family. So some of that information isn't literally translated. It's got to be somewhat interpretive because of the perspective. And it's all in English for the most part, but it's different mindset and relationship. So in a lot of cases, you may be dealing with a grandmother or grandfather who has extensive role in a child's life. So the other thing we want to talk about is, what is a reservation rancheria colony? Because that may make a difference for you when you're dealing with the victim, is to be familiar. If they say rancheria, that's one thing. If they say reservation, that's another thing. And so we wanted to share this with you too. So again, where this says it's territories that were reserved for tribal people. And again, that's where in California, we'll show you in a little bit where these communities ended up. And again, they're established by public policy again. So you're working for an agency that is a public entity. And so whether it's not because of what you did or didn't do, it's going to come from some of this long-term history of interacting with representatives of government entities. That makes sense? So reservations, different situations. And so some of the places that our people come from are reservations. And this is, again, different policy. Rancherian colonies are another public policy, what we call Indian Reorganization Act. And so different tribal communities will be set up by different public policy. So just so you have some background on it, because some people may say something that sounds a little quirky to you, but it's just because it's how it is. So for California, well, throughout the United States, but a lot here in California is a lot of our tribal people have not been given federal recognition. And why is that? Because we don't want to create any more burden on the federal government or take away any more land from the public at large. So we really have about 50 tribes that have not been given federal recognition. And that equates into thousands of tribal people who are not eligible for benefits and services that they would have been if they'd been federally recognized. So there's a lot of Indian people that have been cut out of the service system. And so they will come directly to you because they're still eligible for state, federal services. Yeshelle wanted me to address disenrollment because some of you may come into a situation where you work with someone who's been disenrolled from a federal tribe. So that means is although they may have they are tribal, if they've been disenrolled, it means they're no longer eligible for those services through their tribe. So you might hear some of that, and that's very controversial in tribal communities today.
Well, and it's become very violent in some cases when you get victims. What it was up in Blue Lakes. What happened?
I'm not sure. No,
last year.
Well, no.
Anyway,
say where.
we had. Well, it's what happens. You know, my uncle said we had a woman go in and kill some of the members of the board that were her relatives, and I was talking to my uncle about it, and he said, "Sister, this is expected to happen." He said, "When you've been a member of your tribe for generations, you know, there's no end to when you weren't, your family wasn't a part of it, and somebody comes and takes that away from you, disenrolls you, tells you you're no longer a part of it. What are you going to expect?" You know, you have elders all of a sudden that are told that they have to move out of the homes that they've had for the last 70 years. We've had law enforcement do standbys for disenrolled members that have to pack up their stuff and move out of their tribe. Could you imagine just being told you have to move out of your house if you can't pay your mortgage anymore? That's one thing, but for somebody to just come and say you're no longer a member of this family, how that might make you feel. So we have a lot of issues that are happening, and you may see some of the victims from those kinds of things, but that's what's happening to us here, especially in California. So, you know, there's a fight for money.
So we look at, there's different statuses, again, federal recognized and non-federally recognized. And again, I know you guys are saying, what's the federal recognition and what's that got to do with it? But it really is the thing that solidifies our right to benefits and services. And it's so important for us because that's all we have left, really. Of course, we work like everybody else, but I mean, from the historical standpoint, for the continuance of our people, we know that these lands need to be retained and expanded if possible to continue our people. So I wanted to establish a legal status because a lot of times people look at it from a racial standpoint. And again, I just want to clarify that it isn't because of our race as American Indian, it's our status, federal status in public policy. And so Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution vest Congress with authority to engage in relationships with tribes. And so that's how we are able to say, so to speak, stand our ground, is that federal recognition. And again, government to government. So what we're looking at now is that there are 565 federally recognized tribes in the United States. And of those, now it's a little more, about 111 in California, because some tribes recently got back their federal status. And just recently, I think it's Ione, the tribe here in the Sacramento area, that was able to get some land back. And it really is disturbing to me that people from all over the world can come and buy land in the United States and they get title to land, and our American Indians are still having to go through constitutional acts and local government's approval for us to regain our land. So it's kind of interesting when we see what's happening. You know, a lot of other countries own land in America. There's a recent survey about who was buying land around the Air Force bases, and it was startling for the people doing the research to find out how many foreign people own the land around our Air Force bases. And so there's a specific study that's going to happen around how those people bought that land without somebody raising a red flag, because these are foreigners that own the land. Anyway, the tribal government too, you may have some situations where different tribal names will come under one reservation, because in California, like in many other states, they consolidated the tribes from regions to one area, particular area. So in this case, this Round Valley is in Mendocino County. So does anyone deal with Mendocino County? Yeah, okay. So like there, Round Valley has a number of tribes in that community from different areas of Northern California. So you've got different tribes under one reservation. So somebody may say, I'm such and such from Round Valley, when you may have heard Pitt River over in the other area. It's because of the changes in the historical location of tribes. And so, yeah, they may still have some people back over here in Shasta County, but there's a lot of the same people over in Mendocino County. So don't be surprised if you get some mix there, because that has happened. We want to share some of the commonalities with tribal governments and other governments, so that you can see that there's a relationship there, and that they're just as concerned about the health and safety of their people. They're looking at using their resources as efficiently as possible, as effectively, and then to provide services to their tribal population. Really, a lot of the work advocacy is in protection of natural resources, like what is happening with water today. And then looking at how can they develop healthy economies. And of course, here in the main events nowadays is the news about the casinos. And out of the 111 some tribes, there's only about maybe 20 tribes, if that many, that really have casinos that are generating a lot of income.
Are you a millionaire from your tribe?
No, no. So I think we look at tribal governments similar to other governments, really looking at how we can share some of the economies that are happening, economic development happening on tribal lands. And really in the more modern recent history of tribal communities is that tribal governments are contributing significantly to the rural economy of California, because they're created jobs, and they buy their products and services from local businesses. And so we're seeing a lot of changes happening in rural California, where people are not just working seasonally, but working full-time year-round. So what it means is they get to buy cars, they get to buy houses, they get to invest in their children's education. So the benefits of that are multiple. And one of the things we know about tribal governments is that they offer benefits. And one of the things we also know about tribal governments is that they employ more non-tribal people than tribal people. So it's not just about tribal economic development, but it's about economic development in rural California. So some of the things we want to share with you is some of the things that the tribes deal with. So you'll know a little bit about their structure, because you might be calling them, and this here is talking about, they have tribal constitution just like we have the Constitution for the United States. And so it defines the structure, the powers, and tribal administration. So these are the tribal administrative level is where a lot of you will be working with, because in the tribal administration, that's where the different programs are, if they have them, where those different programs are going to be at is in the tribal administration. So for example, I mentioned early on that we administer the victim services program for 37 tribes. So Yeshelle would be able to tell you for the tribes in her area some of the services and resources that are available for tribal people in those communities, as do other advocates that work with intertribal.
Let me share something with them there too. So even though I do that, things change all the time. There are times when I call someone and sometimes I have a contact person at a tribe and I'll say, who's the chairperson now? I don't assume that I know who it is or who's the administrator. Is it still this person or that person? Do you still have available a domestic violence fund or whatever it is that we're looking for? Because those things change. Just like when we get a new sheriff or a new district attorney in a county, and you know, things change with that person. That's what happens in our tribe. So I'm never 100% sure. If you ask me a question, I will probably say, let me call them and double check that I know what I know, so we're both on the same page, because I don't want to ever tell you, yeah, they offer that, then I call, find out there's changes and they don't offer it anymore. So if you said, oh, but they did last time was last time. We always got to make sure that we know what's going on now. So that, and I don't mind if you're uncomfortable calling somewhere or asking those questions to be the one that calls for you. I don't mind doing that at all. So use me if you need to.
So again, this is just to familiarize you with some of the things that are available through tribal government. Not all tribal governments, but some of the tribal governments. This is a little bit of an organized have all programs, and not all some tribes have consortias. So we're going to talk a little bit about consortias later on, just to kind of move along here. So this is kind of where we're at now with the reservation and rancheries in California. So this is where we were pre-contact, and this is where we are now. So that alone, I think, tells you the story. Some of the tribal lands you can't even see on there because they're like 50 acres, 20 acres, 30 acres. So the larger ones that you see are maybe 80,000 acres, 70,000. But those, maybe there's 3 or 4 of those in the whole state. So again, this is about the elimination of resources made available to a group of people and how it impacts their lives. And I'm sure if we were to take our different communities and reduce them down to equivalent land sizes, we'd see a whole different picture in California. But again, this is relative to tribal communities.
An example of when she says rural, what that means. First of all, I like Chevys and I've always driven one, but I kind of need one. Some of these areas, especially in the winter, you got little graded roads and there's rock slides and mudslides sometimes, and you get up in there and I'm doing an ad for Verizon here, but Verizon's probably the only system that can get in there where the cell phones are working. So some of these families, you know, everybody goes, oh, can you email me this or that? And the families don't even have internet because it doesn't do very well where they are, or the only thing they have are cell phones because they can't afford to have both a landline and a, you know, cell phone or whatever. And the cell phones only work in certain areas. So if I want to talk to a victim, sometimes I say, well, at 11 o'clock, can you go down to the, you know, corner store where you get reception and call me, or I'll call you and we'll talk about what we need to, and then they'll drive back up to their home. So it's not, when we say rural, we mean rural, and there's sometimes if the weather's too bad, you cancel seeing a victim, or a victim can't come off the hill with the vehicle they're driving because of the weather conditions. That's the kind of rural she's talking about. And so what does that translate to? Officers and different people, sometimes they're flaky. They don't ever answer their phones. You know, these different things that really aren't the case. There's geographical hindrances that happen in these cases. So it's not a lot of times what you think it is. There's something else going on.
Any questions? Okay. So we want to talk a little bit about traditions. I'm going to try and get through this because I know we have time here. So there's different tribes have different types of historical stories that are their creation stories. So, but most tribes have creation stories. So sometimes you're going to have people that are going to tell you a whole bunch of stuff, but it's going to be important for them to share that with you. So this may be one of the things that they're going to share with you. So it's not odd, or it's not just something that they're sharing to take up time. It's really important for them to share some of these things, where they come from, who they are, where their family come from, who the family is. Just like Yeshelle explained what our family's responsible for in our community. Different families have different roles in their community. So some of the things that, again, Yeshelle mentioned, seeking out traditional healers. People are still doing that today, looking for traditional healers. My doctor passed recently, and I still haven't found who that new healer will be for me. But they'll find you sometimes. So for us, and so sometimes your victims may talk about that, right? Have any of you heard any tribal people talk about their traditional healer? And you may hear that. So again, that might be something you want to consider in terms of your policies. How does that impact policy around what we can and can't do? So right now, if someone asks for a traditional healer, do you know what the response might be on that? So that might be something we want to look at in terms of being, responsive to a group of people, that this may be, really important to them in terms of their changing how they look at working on something, doing something, so that you need them to do. So, yeah, we have a question.
Because our staff is have to go by our regulations and policies that we have in place, the license of a provider really drives what we allow and what we pay. When you speak of traditional healers, you mentioned that it was your doctor.
Mm-hmm.
Do those traditional healers usually have a license that corresponds, or is it someone within your community that they see? Because that's something that really drives, so we can completely understand choosing someone who is a healer that goes along with tradition. But for us, if they aren't an MD or an OD or some sort of license, then sometimes our hands are tied as far as what we can pay for.
And I think we're attempting to address that, because again, part of the healing and recovery in tribal communities is engaging traditional healers. I would say that in a lot of the areas, the tribal healthcare systems are incorporating traditional healers within their programs and services under their licensed or degreed or doctorate level folks. So that may be one of the approaches if someone is seeking traditional healer, is to look at the Indian healthcare service in that community. And there are 33 Indian health programs throughout the rural areas, and then there's 8 that serve urban tribal people. So there are resources out there that you can use that have legitimate license and degree necessary, meet the requirements, and they in turn work with the traditional community. So it's kind of a way of addressing that need in our tribal communities that may not otherwise be available. So thank you for asking. So these are some of the traditions that are still being carried on, although we'll talk about some of the trauma and dysfunctional behavior in tribal communities, which is some of the reason why they get to our doors, right? It's some of that not so good stuff. But these are some of the things that can help these victims, and some things we incorporate in terms of our working with victims that we serve in tribal communities. So being aware of some of the traditional things that are still important to tribal people, it really can create a comfort level for them too. Understanding that these things are still important to many of the tribal families. So we wanted to share a little bit about the traditions. And these are really important for tribal people to participate in. So you may have a victim who is right in the middle of a traditional seasonal celebration or a prayer time, or what they call purification, or I know they have world renewal ceremonies up in Northern California. So these are different things that the people, if you're aware of some of the culture and tradition that could help them get through that trauma or that experience they're having, not that you know it all, but that you're aware of it and that it may influence their decision whether to do something you think is appropriate or not for them, that they need to do or not. And this may be taking some of that time away from that because it's that time of the year. And because it's really important to the families, they will not be able to respond timely sometime in some of the things that you're doing. Not to say that it's an excuse, but that there's a reason behind it that is very real to them, to us, I should say. So seasonal based gatherings, sometimes there's only certain times of the year that they can gather certain types of medicinal plants or food, or fish or whatever. So those things are still going to drive a lot of our tribal people, not the folks in the urban areas, although a lot of the folks in the urban areas will travel for their own religious activities back in their homeland. So that may affect how they interact with you too, because it may be a time of season when they have to travel or go to particular events in their community.
Too, because it's happened for me working in urban areas that we have natives from other states, and it's important for me when I'm working with people that I know that they're getting help from someone within the state so that they're better understood, because there have been times when I've seen somebody from out of state trying to help with a victim who's native, to California, and the things that they want them to do or the ways that they want to help them aren't our traditional ways. And so we kind of want to turn it back around, and I've sometimes had to say that that victim needs somebody from their area to be helping them with what they're going through right now, because this isn't the normal way the route we take for whatever that person's going through. And so I'm really careful about, well, what band are you, or what tribe are you, and what state is that? Sometimes I have to ask, because we want, if we're somebody from out of state, I'd want to get them hooked up with someone from their area to better help them. It's kind of a vice versa, mutual thing there.
So these are just some examples: seasonal based gathering, harvest based, basket making, regalia making. A lot of the tribal families still are involved in these kind of activities, and there are certain times of the year. And food too is another thing. It's still really important to a lot of our people to eat the types of foods that were traditional foods for our families. And so a lot of tribal people are going back to more of the traditional food because of the high incidence of diabetes and high blood pressure and those chronic diseases. And so what they eat becomes really important. And so again, we're trying to reintroduce a lot of our young people to traditional foods because they tend to be healthy foods. And so we're trying to do that too. So just so you get an idea, these are some of the, here we're talking about basket weaving, because that really is something that's been part of our culture for a long time. And for instance, our tribe, the family I come from, our families have been carbon dated around Clear Lake for 9,000 years. And so our family legacy is 9,000 years back. So our baskets are very old too. So just so you know, because these baskets are very special to tribal people, the women and men that make them pray and really have a purpose for that basket once it's completed. And again, I just want to share that because those may be some resources that victims can use to recover or to really begin to do the things they need to address what happened to them or how you can help them. Bail is another thing that's really important, and the reason A lot of times law enforcement gets involved with searches in the homes and things, and we want to share with law enforcement that some items that they may touch are going to be sacred to tribal people because they're costumes, regalia, something you put on any time. It's really about a religious, spiritual role that that individual plays and that that regalia represents for those individuals. So we really coach law enforcement about when they're going into tribal homes, if they see bundles of things, not to automatically assume that it's a bundle of legal or illegal items. It really can be items that are really a religious purpose. And so to be careful in how to treat it so it doesn't aggravate the situation anymore. Sometimes victims will say that their regalia got damaged and how are they going to replace it? So it is of value to them. Obligations within tribal communities that may impact how victims interact with you because at the time of the season or what's happened in their family. That gets, whatever's happened to them gets put behind and these things that they have to take care of. So these are some of the things you're going to hear about out there, and not to think that you're just making this up so they don't have to do whatever needs to be done or they don't understand.
Well, and I think it's important. We don't have a lot of the basket weavers and regalia makers that we used to have. So some of these people who do it, they do it for a lot of people. And then if they are asking you, hey, am I going to be able to recover, my regalia was damaged by the perpetrator, am I going to be able to recover for that? It doesn't all the time get given to someone, which it does happen that, so, somebody says, hey, I feel like I was supposed to make you, some regalia. It gets paid for too. Sometimes if I want something, I have to go to someone and say, can you make me this? And, mom might have to make them some fry bread, or I might have to come up with a couple dollars or something, but it's not always something that's just given, and they do have to pay to get it replaced. And they may need it by a certain time because they're getting ready to dance, or they've been obligated to dance somewhere or do something. So you don't have a lot of people doing that same thing. So if that person's saying, hey, I really can't, come and meet with you or whatever, I have to do, attend a ceremony, or I have to make regalia or something, it's a big deal for that person and the people that are waiting on it as well.
I think one of the things that we see recovery as part of recovery in our communities is really looking at balance to all things. And really, the Creator plays a major role in our families, and our spiritual health is important, and we're hoping to bring that back to more and more of our tribal families. I think we want to share briefly just some of the historical sources of trauma, because it isn't just about what happened yesterday, it's about what happened over a period of time and how that conditions a group of people and what that trauma looks like. So so that you're not like, how would you say, I don't know, feeling that they're not sharing things with you factually, because it may sound a little hokey pokey because it's around spirituality and what's happened to their families, that kind of thing. Talk about how much money we spend on different things today. At that point in time, you can imagine how much $1 million was in today's amount of money being spent. But there it was talking about it's cheaper to educate Indians than to kill them. And so it finally became public policy, to look at how we can educate American Indians rather than just kill them. So these are some of the historical sources of trauma, the boarding schools. Has anyone heard of the boarding schools before? Yeah. So it'd be like somebody knocking on your door some morning and saying, get your children ready to go. They're going to go to school. And you go, nobody told me about that. Well, we're telling you now, get your kids ready. And that's what happened. So that happened to my mother. Came on her door one day, and she was gone from her family for years.
Wasn't there a lot of abuse as well in the boarding schools?
And I think that's the critical thing about it is when we look at what happens in schools, it's supposed to be about a safe environment, right? For learning, for growth and development. But that was not the case. And unfortunately, a lot of people don't understand what had happened to tribal people. So here, there's series of different institutionalized, government-driven type activity that impacted tribal people at such a physically traumatic level. So the mistrust of government agencies is due to repeated experiences of treatment, saying one thing and doing something else. So I think that's what you're going to be confronted with, are people that have had that experience in their family. So it's not you, but understanding that where that may be coming from, and not to be upset by it, but to understand that there's a basis for that type of distrust. Not because it's you, but because of that historical experience. Does that make sense? Yeah. And this was the way that they thought about it, and that's how everyone was trained to talk to people, just like you're trained how to work with victims, right? This is how people were trained to work with Indian people for a long time. So transfer the savage-born infant to the surroundings of civilization, and he will grow to possess a civilized language and habit. And this was the person who started the Indian boarding schools. And that was based on a prison school. And again, it was an alternative to the costly military campaigns that were where cavalry and people were sent to kill tribal people. So it became cheaper to educate than to kill them. So 500 schools were set up. And these are your children in a boarding school. That's how it would look. And one thing, we've done this cultural competency for like 10 years. And one time one of our presenters said, I never really looked at that picture just till the other day, and there's not one child smiling in that whole picture. So it kind of woke us up too, because we hadn't really noticed that, because we're kind of like blocking things off. But again, my mother was one of these children, taken from her grandfather and mother. All the Indian there is in the race should be dead. And that was, you know, their motto. So again, this is not just something recent, it's pre a lot of the people that are in America today. Immigrants to America have no idea that this happened to the people that came from here. So that started in 1879, and by the from the 1875 to the 1970s, about 60,000 Native American children were removed. And we still have the Sherman boarding school down in Southern California. It's changed significantly. But I think some of you heard these on some documentaries about how tribal people were punished for talking their own language. And I just appreciate being in California, because California is supposed to be one of the more progressive states, in that they say whatever California does, the rest of the nation will follow. And so, you know, it's really good to see what's happening in our having these types of sessions, because we're educating people that serve our community about what really happened. Because I don't think anyone really has heard this before, right? Some of this stuff. And so it's really important to understand where these people are coming from, because it's just like me. I know what happened to my mother, what was done to her when she was 6 and 7 years old, and how she cried night after night because she wanted to go home. And so these things, it wasn't me that suffered it, but I can tell you it hurts my heart whenever I think about what happened to my mother. And so that trauma lives through me, not because it happened to me, but because it happened to my mother. So those are the kind of people you're going to be working with, people who've had that kind of experience. And it really still is carried on because it hurts when you think about what happened to your mother or your father or your uncle or your auntie. So that's how we're looking at it here. So really my mother was probably the best cleaner that I ever knew, housekeeper that I ever knew. We were taught to mop floors 3 blocks down and 3 blocks over, and so you didn't miss one. And we were taught how to iron our clothes properly. But again, it was a good thing in many ways, but we were fortunate. She was a very strong person. This is a little bit about what some of the elders shared with us about the beatings they got and things that happened to them in boarding school. So you could see that it was a lot of trauma for them. And while you're missing from your family, what else are you missing? If you're not with your family. Love. How to do things right. How to interact with your family. How to take care of your family members. You don't have that for 6, 7 years in your developmental stages. What happens? You hardly have it. And so when you come home, you don't know grandma, you don't know auntie, you don't know uncle. Nobody knows you. That's what happened to my mom. She was pretty isolated from her own family because they didn't know how to deal with her after she came home. So these are the history that comes with our families. And so it's not something you did again. It's something our people have experienced. So a lot of children went out, but a lot of children never came home. And families never really found out what happened to them. So it was not a so good experience for tribal people. So when that bonding that happens in a family, that transitional development that happens, all these developmental stages are impacted by where that child is or isn't, the kind of stimulation the child is getting or not. And so when you're malnourished, you're not clothed sufficiently, you're overworked, yada, yada, that's the environment that a lot of our people were raised in, isolation.
She wasn't affected by what happened. It's not really true, and I'm not trying to be disrespectful and call my mom a liar, because she's not. But the thing is yes, we were, because what was taught to my grandmother, she carried on to her. And there were times when my grandmother would say something to me, afraid for me to be hurt physically, sexually or something, or to wear certain things or not to wear them. And one of the biggest traumas for me was I don't have my language. I started speaking my grandfather's language, Spanish, when I was little, and then my grandfather died, and my grandmother wouldn't teach us Pomo or let us keep speaking Spanish. Why? Because she was mean? I had the best grandma on earth. I was spoiled rotten by her. That wasn't the case. She was afraid for me to know that because she equated knowing our language with pain and abuse. So California Indians are different from a lot of other Indians in other states, and we're made fun of, which shows what they've been through too, because you can only really laugh at somebody else's, tragedy, and you've been through it. If there's something wrong, you should be going, oh, I know how that feels. But we lost our language and we lost our traditions, and so other people, we've had to fight that off, even with other tribal people saying, oh, you guys aren't Indian, you don't have your language and you don't have some of your customs. And that's what we fought to regain, and so we are affected sitting here today. I hear the stories that, we look at the woods today and it's nothing like it was in my grandmother's days. And were full of bears and wolves and all kinds of animals. And she and my Auntie Mary were so scared of that boarding school. They were less scared of the dark in the woods at night in the cold. They tried to run away to come home. That's how bad those schools were. They'd rather have dealt with bears and wolves and anything else that might have come their way than to be in that school. So I just wanted to take a minute because I remember those stories, and we fight back tears every time, and that's why I like it when there's two of us, because this stuff is not fun for us and it's not easy. We do it because we care, but it makes me sick every time we have to talk about this stuff, you know, but this is what we do to help our people. So just want to share that with you.
So there's been different, even reservation schools that are run by the federal government, Bureau of Indian Affairs. And so the things that, the injustice is really the repeated experience too, where the abuse wasn't dealt with in a good way. It was overlooked for the most part. So it became acceptable to be abusive to children. So what does that show children? That it's okay to be abusive. So we're beginning another level of life development that includes a lot of abuse and sexual abuse, different activities like that. So that becomes the norm. So this is what Elsie Allen, she's a Pomo woman from Mendocino County. Does anyone deal with Mendocino County here? No? Okay, good. You must be the northern guy then, huh? Yeah. So she says, I never teach my children the language or all the Indian things that I know. I'll never teach them that I don't want my children to be treated like they treated me. And that's what she said about her experience in a boarding school. And that reflects a lot of the feeling of tribal people, is that they wouldn't talk their language or share things with their children because they didn't want them to be hurt. So there's a lot of education and information that's lost because of that fear. So, and that's still, Elsie just passed maybe about 5 or 6 years ago. So this is fairly recent. And so that's kind of what the tone was. This book here, this little pamphlet here, is a compendium, I guess you'd call it, of California state law that indentured Indian children and people right after slavery was abolished. This law came into effect to indenture tribal people. How many of you knew that? So that's something we don't see in our universities and colleges, and we're trying to change that because we think the truth needs to be known about what happened in California because it affects such a specific group of people. And it's really wonderful to see all the activity to protect the rights of immigrants in America. And we'd like to see that come full circle to protect the rights of their first people of America. And missionization of Native Americans was not about religion. When we talk about the illnesses, I think a lot of us see that in the movies about how blankets were distributed and stuff, and disease was spread to our tribal people. So this is around the missions, and I know a lot of people in school that have gone through the California system do the models of the mission, and they're touted as being, you know, really what helped to civilize California. But the history of it, when we look at really what happened there, we found, the researchers found that the children buried at these cemeteries had bowed arms because of the heavy loads that they had to carry to construct the missions. So the children were really used a lot in the mission development. So it's really difficult for me to go into a mission. I never go into a mission because I know that children were used to build those missions and they died from it. So it's really difficult for me as a tribal woman, and I was raised Catholic. My mother raised us Catholic. And once I studied enough about it, I have different thinking about it altogether. So there's a missionization of California if anyone's interested in studying that a little more, but these are the signs of trauma, malnourishment and stuff, and yet it was touted as being a place of caring and taking care of people and raising them to this religion and so on and so forth. But again, the evidence is otherwise, and the impact on the children that were there, the starvation that happened for all the people. So trauma has been in our communities for a long time, and it's come from the policies and decisions and practices of people that represents these institutions. And again, you're in that role today, right, of representing institution that our experience has been very traumatic with representatives of the institutions that are supposed to provide services and benefits. So again, it's not about you, but again about the trauma and the history of that trauma, not just for a short period of time, but for a long period of time. So that story gets told time after time by different people experiencing that trauma at different times through a long period of time. So that's why we really look at how these historical experiences across our different, the men and women and generation upon generation. So what we call this is intergenerational trauma. So how many of you have heard of intergenerational trauma? Yeah, beautiful. So this is why we want to share this with you, because it isn't just about what's happening today for tribal people. It's about a historical thing, and it's been pretty much in every single community. Not any community has been immune from any of this. So that's who's coming to your door. So you might have to take a little extra time or whatever, but when you look at that Land O'Lakes, when you get a chance, if you have Land O'Lakes in your Frigidaire, if you take and fold her at the waist where her hands are holding that product, her knees will come up to where her hands are, and look what that looks like. Can anyone see that? I can find it for you. It's bare breasts she's holding. So I really find that disrespectful. I don't think that any woman in this room would want that to be on a product that you use to eat, is a pornographic figure. But this is acceptable. But it's dehumanizing to certain people. That's not something our people would approve of nor practice.
Our women in our that talking about your body parts or anything to do with them or what goes on between a man and woman or in a relationship is not something you talk about. So when they get violated and they become a victim and they're in the system, it's really hard for them to talk about these things, because we were taught that to be, a translation from my language is to be shameful, which would translate to modest. It's shameful to show your parts, and it's shameful to talk about those things. And so when, things like this are extremely harsh, she couldn't even say it, the woman's holding her breast. That's culturally wrong for us to, have to look. Our women didn't do things like that. And so, it's degrading, but also you're going to deal with victims, and they're not going to want to talk because it's not part of our culture for us to talk about things that happen to us. And then when you get what has happened to our people on top of it already, being culture, it's a double whammy for them to want to talk at all. So, you get some of you go, oh no, I have to talk to her. She's like a clam. I can barely get 2 words out. That's partly why right there.
I want to just share that with you because that's in our stores every day, and it's really interesting to me. I don't think a lot of people realize that, but the mascot issue too, Redskins, I know people say that's to honor Indian people, but really Redskins were about when you took the scalp. Actually, how many Redskins had children? Woman's Redskin did have. So that's why Redskins isn't like honor to Indian people. It isn't about our skin color. It's about how many body parts or ears or noses or whatever you could prove that bad to get a bounty for it. So how many redskins do you have? That's what that's about. So, you know, and I don't mean to be very rude, but I don't see why there isn't an understanding of that, because we don't have teams that are called black sambos. We don't have teams that are called chink eyes. We don't have teams that are called sombrero dancers or sombrero wearers, or, you know, that kind of thing. How would people feel? I know we got rid of a restaurant that was called Little Black Sambos. I think that was in the, what, 70s or 60s. That restaurant got shut down because African Americans would not stand for it. So when Indians talk about not wanting redskins, why can't people understand that? Because we're not going to have, you know, rice hats up there for Asians and say we're honoring the Asians, or a sombrero there. Just a perspective. So one of the things that we want to share real quickly again is these are dysfunctional behaviors that's been adapted and integrated into tribal communities. And it's very, very much so in our communities. So we see a lot of violent behavior, a lack of parenting skills, and that's from so many family members being taken off to different institutions. And generational breakdown of transference of traditional practices and cultural values. And we see a lot of abuse of alcohol and drugs in tribal communities, gangs, joining gangs, dysfunctional behavior. I think the key thing for us was the lack of parenting skills, because it really stymied the growth and development of our tribal communities, because there wasn't an ability of a lot of the parents to parent, because they were brought up in institutions. So they didn't have that day-to-day interaction with family members. So you're going to see some of that disconnect. So they're urban and rural. We've been kind of talking about this all along. There's urban communities. These were in what they call relocation programs. And there were thousands and thousands of tribal people taking from reservations and rancherias to the urban areas for training and jobs and stuff. So there's different types of characteristics: social and cultural isolations, separation from the family members, access to resources, different types of resources, or no access to resources. So these are some of the challenges that are out there. The rural ones, as Yeshelle had mentioned earlier, are some of the long distances, geographical locations. We had a CPS worker where we did a cultural competency out on one of the tribal lands, and she had to travel 30 miles to get out to the reservation. And she said, I've been working for, I think it was over 20 years in CPS, and she said, I never knew how far our family, the tribal family members had to travel to come to my office. But it took her going out there to a tribal, to the reservation where we did the training, and she realized why they didn't make appointments, why they didn't complete things that they were supposed to, because it took 60 miles really to get there and back. And then if you don't have a car, guess what happens? You don't have bus transportation out there, guess what happens? So these are some things your people are going to be experiencing. So don't be discouraged. It's real stuff that they have to deal with. So lack of education is another thing, because how do you think tribal people felt about education when a lot of their families were so badly hurt by education? So there's some disconnect there. And the loss of our traditional language and practices, a lot of the healthy stuff that we knew and practiced doesn't exist anymore. We have to recover. So these are some other laws that affect California specifically, is PL Public Law 280. We talk about this because California is one of several jurisdictions or states in the United States that have jurisdiction over tribal lands. In other states, the tribes have jurisdiction on their lands. In California, we're working on it under the concurrent jurisdiction with tribes.
I
was just wondering if that affects reporting crime to law enforcement, who you report to, and then even one of our guidelines is that you participate in prosecution or assist with prosecution for certain crimes, and the relationship between maybe victims, Native American victims, and CPS or other law enforcement agencies.
Try and press my buttons, girl. There's a lot of problems. They have criminal jurisdiction that the sheriff's department does on tribal land. And so let me give you a few scenarios that are problems here that I can think of that I've dealt with. So you get a victim. I had one had her fingers pretty much cut off. And I got to her, she was at her sister's, she managed to get off the res, and rarely do we have parts of families living off the res. A lot of times they're on either the same res or, you know, another one, which could be 20, 15, 10 miles away. So her sister happened to live in town in one of my counties, and I got her after her sister had already been at the ER with her. They did some of what they needed to do in the ER, and then the rest of it they had to schedule for surgery. So she was going to have surgery in the morning, and I took her to get some food and some clothing because she obviously fled. And law enforcement had already dealt with her and everything. So I get out there, and I know this family well. And I said, okay, so we got all that taken care of. We made a plan in my truck of what we were going to do the next day. And she starts getting threats because the people on the res know where she is, because you guys think, I've told you before, some of you guys got email and text messaging and, you know, all that stuff. Indians don't need any of that. We somehow, some way, we've got some gift that everybody knows everything within 5 minutes. He's laughing. I'm crying sometimes. It ain't no joke. Even your personal stuff. And they'll make it up too, let me tell you. But anyways, so he gets to her, and the family starts threatening her. They get her back out to the res, and I get a phone call in a little whisper, because she's praying that nobody hears her, that she doesn't want to follow through with anything now. So what has happened? She's been threatened. She's afraid of retaliation. His family lives on that res, and so does hers. Now, even if she's to go to another res that is 35 miles away, as soon as she enters that res, he knows people there just as well as she does. Somebody's going to call and let him know, or he's going to call over there and say, hey, have you seen so-and-so? Like nothing's happened. And how do they know? They may be protective of her if they know, but if they don't know anything's happened, and they go, oh yeah, I saw her drive through here 10 minutes ago with so-and-so. So then he's over on that res, or he's having people there intimidate her. A lot of our people, you know, I know me because I get out. We've always been social butterflies. I have friends all over the U.S. I could call somebody in New York right now and say, hey, I'm coming to New York. I'm going to stay with you. Our people on the res don't have anyone off that res a lot of times, off that reservation, or in town even, or, you know, to be in another county or state or whatever would be huge. They don't have it. And even if they do, you know, they know that they can't trust that. And say he's the one supplying the money, or some cases drugs or whatever it is, to that family. And they know that if he's in trouble, they don't get what they need. So guess who becomes a priority? The perpetrator or the victim? It's a, you know, matter of survival for the family, so they're going to do what they have to do. Law enforcement, we have issues with law enforcement getting out to it. I know with my band, we are 4 miles away from either the SO or the PD. Only 4 miles. So why, now I'm going to say this, we have a really good sheriff now, and we're working on these little issues of how come it took 2 hours for 4 miles? How come, you know, the perpetrator can be good and gone or make up a story and get people to follow by the time they get out there? She knows that. Is she going to want to call? Or is she going to want to follow through with you? You know, they know what's coming, and they know that people get behind it, and people do what they have to. And sometimes it's not even about they don't want to protect her. They know that if they protect the victim, that other members, and a lot of times in leadership, are going to come after them. They get cut off from what they need, or they don't feel safe at night in their home openly helping protect someone. So it can be really sticky. And CPS is another story unto itself about what happens with our families. That one you don't want me to start on.
Could you set up a protective areas maybe?
I think that's a good idea. And really, we do want to look at shelters, you know, where we could do that. But it is a while in coming, because we've really laid a lot of groundwork just to get services, you know, out there. And so, yeah, I think that's wonderful to hear that, because I think that's something we would like to strive for. His comment was, since she described what happens on the reservation, wouldn't it be better to be off the reservation? And the answer is yes, probably at this point in time, absolutely.
But we have some, you know, cases where we have safe houses, but they're in the same town as the tribe, and are you serious? They are going 3 miles to what they're deeming a safe house, and everybody knows where they're going. How safe is it? And frankly, because of that scenario, I've had re-victimization from them being so close in these rural areas. Everybody knows everybody. You can't drive through town without people knowing what. Yeah, I drove to town with my slippers on, you know, and everybody's talking about it. So something like that, really everybody's talking about, and it's not a safe situation a lot of times.
So we are working, you know, with the different shelters and different programs, and little by little, we're getting there. But again, it's just learning about the situation and what resources are. So understanding cultural values and traditional practices of people, so that it doesn't offend you or it doesn't seem unreasonable or whatever. So that's what our hope is today, is that we translate, you know, transfer some of that knowledge to you, so that you don't take it personal if someone does seem to be a little irrational or belligerent or whatever. Not to say that it's you know, it justifies it. It's just to understand where they might be coming from. We have a lot of revival of traditional dances and ceremonies, and again, as we recover and seek wellness in our communities, this is becoming more and more important to our tribal people. And respect for elders, that's key in our culture. And honor for women, that's a different image than what is out there in society, because it's been, you know, that we're less than. And I know that women overall have had to fight for rights over the years, so this is nothing new even to women in the general public, but again, for tribal women, that image has always been such a negative one. And there was a traditional nurturing of tribal children, and I think that was the thing we've always been raised from the moment of conception, that that's a spirit, a new spirit of the Creator that is being brought into the world. And so that isn't widely practiced as we had that practice. But again, we see a lot of abuse and neglect, and where does that come from? It's from that historical generational trauma where parents or people haven't had the experience of being raised in a family. So if you have thousands of people not raised in a family, thousands of people don't know how to rear a child, don't know how to interact as a family. So that's recovering, that's part of recovery. So these are some emerging practices: tribal engagement, developing those relationships. When you're planning, designing, implementation, evaluation, refinement, modification, that kind of thing. That's tribal engagement. If you work in tribal communities, how do you outreach to them? And what are some programs available in the tribal communities? So in the tribal communities, there's a lot of these types of services. The key is to become aware of what types of services and programs are available for them. And again, if you have any questions, you know, you can always direct them to Intertribal and we can get you connected to your local resources or local tribe. So this shows you how a broad of different programs that tribes could have. Not all tribes have all these services. Some tribes just aren't able to at this point in time. So healing and recovery, we're at that point, I think, in our tribal communities. And I think we're looking towards bringing spirituality back into our communities for our children and youth. And again, that spirituality and traditions is really a part of our recovery, healing and recovery in tribal communities. So we're working on that too. And again, that message of the traditional practitioners being part of our communities, that's recovering in our communities too. These are some of the different programs that are available here in Sacramento even. If you work in the Sacramento area, we have the Red Road, the Medicine Wheel. We also have what is called Fatherhood is Sacred. So if you have fathers you're working with or children where we need some coaching or whatever, we can find those kinds of resources out there. These are different activities that tribal communities are carrying on that represent, you know, the unity of the tribal people. Talk about resources, networking. We only have 5 minutes, Yeshelle, but Yeshelle's one of the specialists in this part of it. She works with the Family Justice Centers. How many of you have heard of Family Justice Centers? Yeah, that's an emerging approach too, and we're part of the Family Justice Centers. We have MOUs and MOAs with different entities. So these are important to us, all these things, and I'm sure you recognize them, things that you have to do. So resource development, identify the resources that tribal people have to offer because it acknowledges their capacity as a group to be of value. And I think this is key to providing any kind of wraparound, client-focused, client-driven services when you're looking at victimization. These are different types of programs that are out there with the tribal communities. And I don't know if some of these are ones that you would necessarily look for your victims, but again, these are different types of resources that are out there, just so you can see.
Since we only have a few more minutes, Rachel, did we cover everything that you felt like you needed us to? That's what I was going to open up for any questions that anyone might have. Yeah, oh, that's right. I got it.
The Mending the Basket seminar up in Humboldt a few weeks ago, and it was very powerful, very powerful. And I love what they're doing, the Warrior Project up there, reaching the youth of their communities to try to restore some of the culture and tradition that has been lost. My question is, what I was struck by when I was up there was the high percentage of the domestic violence and abuse that was going on the reservation that went unreported. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that goes back to a lot what you spoke about, the mistrust of the government, and we being a government agency, we need to find a way to bridge that gap. And they're one of the most underserved populations that we serve. And I just, what I want from you is any kind of suggestions you have to overcome that obstacle of them trusting the government or not trusting the government in a way that we can help serve them and offer some of our services.
I think just communications. And I think it might take a little more than normal in terms of communications and sharing perspectives, you know, clarifying why a certain thing has to be done sequentially, that it will take time if it takes time, or if it engages more people, if they need to talk to more people, really coaching them about that process. I think that's the best thing that can be done, is taking that extra step if it does have to happen, of information, maybe 2 or 3 times, it may need to be repeated. And to see if there's any resources. And then again, that's why we like to, not only that it's just intertribal, but that folks in those different areas are available to help too, and we can put you in contact with those folks at the local level. So I think time and repeat, clarify, because it doesn't click sometime. And we know that's with us too, certain things that don't click with us. And this may be, especially this type of situation may be what they will need repeated support for. So in that sense, I think that's the one thing, but also to begin to become familiar with what other resources are out there. Because when you mention Indian health, or you mention the Indian education, or you mention another resource, they know that you're clicking in. And they can hear that just by what you know to share with them. That will engage them and that will help them. So even some of the things you hear here, you don't have to repeat it to them, but be aware that it may be something that impacts them. And just to be a little bit more aware, I think, is the most that we can expect right now. Because once you start working with that community, you start finding out what resources they have, the gears will shift. And that's what happens for us too. Like Yeshelle mentioned, there's change in the local administration for tribes, there's change in local leadership. So you may develop a relationship for 1 year, the next year you got to start all over again. So don't get discouraged, because we have experienced the same thing, because there are changes at the local level. There's changes in family structures sometimes. So we just spend a little extra time to become more familiar. So don't think you're the only one. We go through that same thing too. But again, yeah.
I think the fact that you're showing up says a lot. And I know, you guys don't get a lot of travel, but the bottom line is they want to see you out there eating with them, joking with them. I told one of our new law enforcement sheriffs in one of my towns, he said, how are we going to repair this mess? I said, ice cream socials with the kids playing, shooting some hoops, those kinds of things do repair. And Indian people, we like food. If I'd have been able to this morning, I didn't sleep at all last night, but I'd have brought you guys some chocolates. We like food and we like eating it with you, and that's how our people do things. We get comfortable like that, and then the relationships start forming.
Well, and two, you can find local advocates in your community, whether it's a tribal council member, whether it's a tribal elder. Find someone, especially if you're working a lot with tribal communities. And if you're not working a lot, maybe just being aware of some of their resources, or what questions you can ask to say, what kind of services does your tribe provide? What kind of services can I access for you that way? Can I advocate? So just being a little bit more aware, saying some things that can trigger a good thought or understanding. I think communication is always key for us too. So I really appreciate that question, because we really do look to, again, outreach, engagement, and advocacy assistance. So again, we go back to our families. This is what it's all about, that victim, what kinds of services they need in this time of trauma and challenge, and what resources are out there for them. And if we can't help you find those resources, we'll connect you to the tribe so they can tell you what those resources are. So we are not always the primary provider, but we can get you in touch with the primary providers in their communities. So that's what we'd like to offer. And again, thank you for this opportunity to share this information with you, and hopefully if you have any questions, you know how to get a hold of us in our Tribal Council, California. Thank you very much for your time.